This is part 2 of a commentary I'm doing with 8363MTR on Mr. Enter's video on animated PSAs. If you have not seen part 1 yet, I would recommend doing so before continuing on with this video, link in the description.
What's next? I'm done with this.
Wait, wasn't that robot going to introduce all the topics? What happened to him exactly?
Speaking of things that should have stayed in the 90s, the Animaniacs had a reboot. A lot of people really seem to like it. Then there are others, the people who notice that Dot is actually in the show. Not to, mansplain, but when the theme song says no mansplaining, you can't expect that to not rub people the wrong way. It's alienating, which is the last thing that you want to do in a theme song.
Well, wait a minute, how alienating is the show? Because the point of a theme song is to introduce new viewers to what they're about to watch. So if the show is alienating, an alienating theme song would actually make sense.
Look, Dot was always a feminist character. People who say she wasn't never watched the original. But in the reboot, they did take her in a lot more of an abrasive direction.
Slight nitpick to your editor, Coda here, but I absolutely love that you used that picture of Dot when Mr. Enter was explaining about how over the top of Dot being a feminist is, when the actual part of the episode is really more towards an exaggerated thing about giving cartoon characters the right to vote instead. Like, yeah, the first part was about women's right to vote, but it actually ended up having more of a cartoony and over-the-top plot instead.
It's kind of the difference between third wave feminism and fourth wave, honestly.
The fuck? When did the fourth wave start? The only thing I can think of is that TERF website, Fourth Wave Now. Wait, Enter, are you saying Dot is a TERF?
That's it! I'm canceling Dot on Twitter!
Someone call the BBC.
To put it short, in this version of Animaniacs, Dot is the character who will fight against gendered language while telling you to stop mansplaining, manterrupting, and having a mantrum.
Oh, hi there, Big Rat! How are you doing on this fiend in D&D? Question, did you get any royalties out of these anti-feminists?
Wait a minute, that was a Freedom Tunes cartoon from 2015. John, is that where you get your impression of modern feminism? Because that's quite literally the only time I've ever seen somebody do this.
What I'm trying to say is that the modern Animaniacs really wears its politics on its sleeve, and it doesn't do it any favors. Once again, Animaniacs has always been political. It's even been abrasive at times. What it hasn't always been is alienating. And the Animaniacs reboot finds itself in a time period when political tensions are worse than they've been in at least half a fucking century.
You do know that most of the political divisions we see today can be traced back to the 90s, right? Hardline Republicans like Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, and Grover Norquist cannibalizing the first George Bush over tax hikes, although, to be fair, that was also a bit of a trap that George Bush set himself up for, considering he promised in his 1988 RNC speech to not raise taxes. Although he primarily said that in order to appeal to Reagan purists who still didn't quite forgive him for calling supply-side economics voodoo economics during his 1980 presidential campaign, despite the fact he had been Reagan's vice president for 8 years at that point. Then when Clinton became president in 1992, although he took office in 1993, but you guys know what I mean, Republicans quickly unified against him. Newt Gingrich created GoPac, which was specifically designed to help Republicans win Congress through negativity. They also promoted various forms of divisive media. This was the decade where Rush Limbaugh became a national name and Fox News began, remember? And I could go on and on and on, but I'm just going to be blunt with you, John. This did not happen overnight, and Animaniacs was there when it began. So, to put it another way, why is it appropriate for them to act like it then, but it's not appropriate for them to act like it now? If anything, it would likely be less appropriate for them to act like it back then, because by that point, the problem hadn't started yet, and you could argue that they helped create it. Now, it's already here, so what's a cartoon going to do?
Shows like this are bordering on irresponsible. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had political riots and people trying to take over buildings to meet political ends.
Yeah, and the 90s had Timothy McVeigh filling a Ryder truck full of explosives and crashing into a building as a form of political terrorism he took from the white supremacist novel The Turner Diaries after being inspired by a combination of the incredibly popular militia movement and, to be fair, not all that unreasonable reasonable outrage over how the ATF handled the Waco siege. Seriously, coming from someone who wrote an entire book about the event the picture John shows is from, the only conclusion a reasonable person could come to is it was primarily caused via the normalization of right-wing political terrorism that occurred over multiple decades. There's no back in my day here, John. I'm sorry, there just isn't.
Also, I thought that Trump was the one who told his supporters to march to the Capitol and create an insurrection. In fact, I thought that Trump made things more divisive due to how he talked negatively about the left, especially on Twitter, such as how the Black Lives Matter protesters are thugs, thus having some of the people on the right to complain about how the people on the left are snowflakes. Why the hell are you making it out like political cartoons such as the Animaniacs are the biggest issues on the planet when shows like this shouldn't really be the main problems of our overall political climate due to people getting upset over it?
Buy my book, The Definition of Sedition.
You freaking shill.
Speaking of divisive bullshit, we gotta talk about gun control. Again. Oh no, I'm sorry. We have to talk about bun control. that is no, really. Excuse me for a minute. I must really process how intensely clever that pun was. You must be some kind of comedic genius to come up with that kind of intricate wordplay. No, seriously, Chucka Conroy is blushing at you masterfully changing the letter G to the letter B. What other kind of genius could think of something like that?
You know, I'm starting to think Enter doesn't like that pun. Seriously, I think John's opinion on that wordplay was not positive. What I can conclude from what the person I'm commentating on said is that he dislikes the thing he just discussed. What I'm saying is John needs to learn how to get to the fucking point.
Oh, and considering that this is the next thing that he reviews, let's do a quick synopsis. Bun Control was one of the 3 shorts in episode 4 of the Animaniacs reboot. In it, a farmer named Dwayne Lapstool arrives at the water tower selling bunnies. He tries to sell the bunnies to the Warner Brothers, to which Wacko and Dot love them and bought 2. The bunnies were soon multiplied the next day, and they tried to return it to Dwayne, but Dwayne refuses. CEO Nora Rita Norita also refuses to solve the problem, saying that she does want to keep the bunnies in the studio. This then got the Warner Brothers and Warner's sister angry after the water tower exploded, filled with bunnies, and had an anime action scene. Dwayne wins the battle, but not the war, as Wacko calls the dingoes for help. The dingoes takes all of the bunnies and sell them to people, with Dwayne being bagged up and put in a truck. And in the end of the episode, one of the dingoes commented that this episode is about gun control. And for those of you who don't know, Dwayne is actually a parody of Wayne LaPierre, a guns rights activist and the executive vice president of the NRA.
The satire of this episode, if you could call it that,
the only thing biting here is the satire.
That's what they call it. Doesn't work because the scenario doesn't work in context.
Studies show that owners of multiple buns feel safer from the threat of other owners of multiple buns.
Look, skeleton remotes I could kinda get. You shoot them at someone and something permanent happens. It didn't really have a negative effect in the long run, but it was something permanent, I will give them that. A bunny, like a rabbit, unless you're a farmer or Elmer Fudd, isn't actually a threat to anyone.
You clearly have not seen Night of the Lepus. Or Watership Down, that also works.
In a situation like this, you can't just preach to the choir. You have to be on your A game. You need to speak to the people who don't agree with you. And they're gonna point out this stupid writing right up front. And gun control is a very divisive issue. Actually, that's kind of getting to be less true. One of the odd little quirks of 2020, the year that this came out, it was a banger year for gun sales in the United States. Roughly 8.5 million people bought their first gun in 2020. And get this, mostly in liberal areas. You know, the people in this country that support gun control. Or used to, I guess.
And it's later, because I've actually found Enter's source. So, because Enter didn't link any of his sources at all, I've actually had to find a source that he presented, even with me being dumb and not looking at the bottom right corner of that graph here. Nevertheless, I did find the article that you're referring to. The article is made by Rashawn Ray and Rebecca Shankman, and the article is entitled How COVID-19 is Changing the Gun Debate, published on June the 17th, 2020. While it is true that liberal states are seeing an increase in gun permit applications from February to April, I've decided to read up on the article if there's anything that you might be missing. And lo and behold, there was. Quoting from the article, from February to March 2020, using data from ammo.com, ammunition purchases in states that voted for Democrat Hillary Clinton in 2016 were nearly double that of states that voted for Republican Donald Trump. However, much of the ammunition purchases are concentrated in 2 states, Delaware and Vermont. Ammunition purchases in each of these 2 states were about 10 times higher than other states. When Delaware and Vermont are omitted from the analysis, Republican states have larger ammunition purchases than Democratic states.
It should be noted, by the way, that both Delaware and especially Vermont have abnormally large gun cultures for states that are typically considered to be liberal, progressive, and democratic in nature.
Additionally, it is important to note that Vermont, though voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016, had a higher conservative ideology score, 29, than liberal ideology score, 24. Delaware reports the highest percentage of residents in any state with a moderate political ideology score, 43. Nonetheless, it is unclear whether ammunition purchases are dispersed across many people in these states or whether these purchases are limited to a small number of people. Nor did the data tell us who is purchasing guns and ammunition. While some may speculate that liberals are purchasing guns, it could be a surge amongst conservatives in liberal states. Look, there could have been a surge of liberals applying for gun permit, but we don't know that. You're assuming that because it's happening in liberal states that only the liberals are applying for a gun permit, when, again, we don't know if that's the overall case here. However, if we head back to the article that I found due to Enter's graph, I can maybe get a good estimate on who's buying the guns and why they're doing it. That's because I also found out that the article was talking about the lockdown protests, where they also say that 66% of these protests were against a Democratic governor after all Democratic governors did the lockdown, whereas 69% of Republican governors enacted the shutdowns, and only 46 of these protests are in relation to those Republican governors. What Enter doesn't show you guys is the third and fourth figures of the article. That's because as gun permits and conservative ideology increases, states are less likely to protest, while the opposite effect is happening in Democratic states. Due to this, while some people may speculate that people are purchasing guns to protect their family during the first few months of the pandemic, and it could be occurring to a certain extent, these lockdown protests do paint a very big and different picture when it comes to Republicans signing up for a permit and purchasing guns. And honestly, that's my biggest issue with this source. Ignoring that the show was written back in 2018, so they have no hindsight towards what happened after 2 years later, this honestly shows to me that you haven't read the full source, because it pretty much debunks your overall point. My overall suggestion is for you to read what you've seen and double check on them just in case if the source is going to lead you to a different direction than what you're trying to argue for.
Gun control is a harder sell than it has ever been in a long time. And if you want to convince people to ban the things they literally just bought, you're going to need a damn good argument. And they do not have a good argument. This episode's brilliant solution to gun control is just do what Australia did, which is another thing that rings out like it came in 2018, but it was written in 2016. I feel like a robot for saying this, because the Australia argument is so well worn. I don't think that even gun control activists use Australia anymore.
Australia was already experiencing a decrease in gun violence before the ban, and the ban itself had no effect on the already downward trend.
Okay, I'm gonna say this, I honestly really don't like how Enter made this point, because it doesn't cover the overall nuance towards why Australia had a decrease in gun deaths. Why did the gun deaths in Australia see a decrease before the 1996 gun laws? What kind of deaths are we talking about? In fact, a typical gun controller would say to this graph, even though there were no mass shootings after the gun laws, and the fact that the 1996 gun laws actually helped accelerate the downward trend, as indicated by a significant drop of more than 200 deaths from just 2 years apart.
Yeah, that's another constant issue with the video. Although Enter preaches the importance of speaking to those who don't agree with you, which he is right to do so, he never actually really does it. He instead commonly characterizes the other side as, well, straw men, that he creates through smashing various ideas together into some super opposition. You know, instead of just arguing with real people. It's like watching someone argue with the voices inside of their head. Now, this is not either of us saying that we agree or disagree with any of the positions Enter argues for or against in this video. However, if Enter really is dedicated to arguing in a way that could convince the other side, he does a really bad job at it.
To make not only my argument even more valid, but to also do Enter's job and help strengthen his point, what I found out was that, according to the Australian version of ABC, the main reason why we saw a decrease in the graph of gun deaths in Australia was because less people were planning on killing themselves over the years. When it came down towards cause of death, assault by firearm, and homicide victims, cause of death from gunshot wound, they tend to actually fluctuate, but they haven't really gone down in the overall sense of they progress downward over the years. Because of this final point may be a stretch, but truthfully, I think he should have talked more about firearm homicides towards this point, rather than including both firearm homicides and suicides, and other death-related causes by firearms when talking about this. This is because the episode Gun Control wasn't talking nor even implying anything about suicides at all.
Beep boop, libertarian programming activated. During the 2020 COVID pandemic, Australians became unable to leave their country without express permission from their government, preventing many families from becoming reunited, something that typically only happens in totalitarian countries like North Korea, forcing them to deal with some of the strictest authoritarianism and pandemic controls in the Western world. This is likely something that would not have happened in an armed populace.
You know, even though the population of North Korea was armed until 2009. Roughly 5% of the North Korean population is also in the military in some form, meaning that 1 in every 20 citizens in North Korea is armed.
Also, wow, I get us towards where you're coming from, but just because one country is strict with its policies, that doesn't mean that it's in the same vein as being North fucking Korea. I mean, this is never mind too that you don't elaborate on how strict Australia is.
I wouldn't even be so baffled if he acted like this only happened in authoritarian countries like North Korea. No, John, travel restrictions are actually fairly common even among liberal democratic governments. For example, citizens of the US were not allowed to travel to Cuba from the 1960s until 2015. And no person who lives in a UN nation is allowed to go to Antarctica without UN permission. So, John, does this mean that everywhere besides Antarctica is literally North Korea? Fuck, requiring government permission to enter a country is not in the slightest unusual. What do you think passports are, John? So I don't see why the reverse would inherently be unusual either.
And for the final bit of stupid, and I do mean that this is the most stupid part of the episode, because of how little they understand Australia at all. The Animaniacs try to get rid of buns by introducing a predator, dingoes. I want to show you guys something. This is the cane toad. Why am I showing you the pictures of a toad? Well, Australia had this problem with beetles eating up all of their sugarcane, so they introduced a predator to get rid of them. You know, Animaniac solution, introduce a predator to get rid of a problem. Unfortunately, cane toads had no natural predators in Australia, so the cane toads became a big problem as they devastated their ecosystem. And to add insult to injury, the toads didn't get rid of the beetles either. So in order to get rid of the gun violence problem in the United States, we must follow along the lead of Australia by introducing a predator into our ecosystem, which is known as one of the biggest mistakes in Australian history.
Enter, you do realize that they don't actually eat up the bunnies, right? I don't care that you didn't outright say it. You're implying that by saying words like predator and how that's apparently in connections to the cane toad. What actually happens in the episode was that the dingoes actually took the bunnies and sold them to people. And no, I don't care if that scene was supposed to be a metaphor here, even though I personally disagree. Your wording was shit enough to the point where you're implying that this was the case when it wasn't.
Obviously not the absolute biggest sin Australia's ever committed. How they treated the Aboriginals takes the cake on that one. But, didn't this show used to be about 3 cat dog things annoying a psychiatrist in an animation studio? Whatever happened to that?
Even though they didn't just annoy Dr. Scratch and Sniff and were just doing other random stuff such as annoying Michelangelo, or other historical figures too, and also roasted other political figures like Bill Clinton. Actually, what I really don't like about this point is that Dr. Scratch and Sniff came back in the reboot in 2 episodes, one of which is actually a non-speaking role, so we'll ignore that. His major role was actually pretending to be sick to prank on the Warner Brothers so that they can try to find a way to fix him only then to actually turn himself sick by drinking the soda and turning his head into a blimp and crashing outside into a building. So, did you actually watch the reboot outside of the episode by any chance, Mr. Enter? Because if you haven't, then this is an actual shame on your end, as you clearly haven't watched the actual series as a whole. And I don't trust you claiming that you've watched a full series after when you admitted that you haven't watched the entirety of Rise of the TMNT in your Nicaragua review of the show. I'm not kidding, I seriously don't trust you anymore.
So, your favorite show is having a reunion. It's been off the air for like a decade, but they're making a comeback. Just one episode. What are they gonna do? Maybe they'll have some big kind of adventure. Ooh, maybe the characters are older now. Maybe we'll see their deeper, more adult drama. Or maybe they're just gonna tell you how to vote.
Or really just the fact that it's a PSA short that has the cast of 16 saying, wait a minute. Actually, Enter, can you remind us about your definition of what a PSA is in the introduction of your review?
Some of the PSAs are outside of cartoons, like they made a commercial for it, and some of them are basically whole episodes. I'm going to be a little bit loose with the definition of a PSA. For instance, I consider the episode Let's Not Be Skeletons to be a PSA on gun control, even though it's another episode of OKKO, and not a PSA by the traditional definition.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm sorry, but this is false advertising, my dude. I don't even care that you've said it, or if you're fully aware of it, it's still false advertising. The thing about this is that The Greenhouse, Gun Control, and by extension, Let's Not Be Skeletons are considered to be episodes that have a political message, but they're not a PSA. I don't get why you're considering anything political as a PSA, considering that I remember those Foundations for a Better Life PSAs that talks about patience, or loyalty, or even caring. By that extension, does that mean that any episode that has the moral of caring or loyalty is considered to be a PSA? No, because it's just a moral and not a PSA. If anything, this review should have been retitled as The Wild World of Animated Propaganda. Because although I wouldn't agree with you on that, at the very least the title paints a clearer picture about what you're reviewing, because we're now just getting to our first PSA here.
Speaking of which, it's time for yet another episode synopsis. Vote Dude is a PSA special/reunion minisode of 16 released on YouTube on September 12th, 2018. Because the 16s, that being Jen, Nikki, Caitlin, Jude, White, and Jonesy, are all 18 years old, they can register to vote, and Jen gets excited for it. They've talked about the US election, with White being disgusted at Trump and his ruling, and Jonesy later coming in wearing a MAGA hat, much to White's concern. White encourages the other 14s to vote, citing that millennials compose the largest voting group and thus can swing an entire election. With Caitlin, Nikki, and Jonesy disinterested in politics, Jude encourages his friends and nearby shoppers to vote, which prompts Coach Helder to dismiss millennials as special snowflakes with participation trophies, and Ron not knowing the experience of going to war, which just furthers their desire to register to vote, after Jen sarcastically says that they shouldn't register because the older generations will have more power in the election. Then later on, the nerd comes over and reminds them they're all Canadian, and then they just drop everything and focus on their own personal lives.
So, in 2018, the United States was getting into its midterm elections. You see, the way the United States works is that we have a presidential election every 4 years, but there are several other elections in between. And the most significant of those is the halfway point, where we have elections for many members of Congress and senators.
Many members of Congress and senators? John, the Senate is part of Congress. I think what you might have meant is many members of the House, but that's also wrong because every member of the House is up for re-election.
And that gets to determine what kind of legislative branch that our president has to deal with. If the president is a Republican and the two houses of Congress are majority Democrat, it's unlikely that they'll be able to do much.
I should note, the last time the scenario John is describing occurred in American history was the 110th Congress. This was the Congress elected in 2006. Where massive results in favor of Democrats led to Nancy Pelosi becoming Speaker of the House and Harry Reid becoming Senate Majority Leader, despite Republican George W. Bush still being president. To give you an idea on how little the administration could do, 442 laws were passed by that Congress.
Or vice versa. Partisanship in this country is that bad. The last thing that Democrats and Republicans agreed to in the United States is going to war with Iraq, in 2003.
Wait, Wait, John, I thought you said that we lived in a uniquely divided time and that's why the Animaniacs reboot was bad or something. Now you're telling me that extreme amounts of political division have been going on for nearly 2 decades? For that matter, I thought the implication was that division was a bad thing and that's why you showed a picture of January 6th. But if unification and returning to a time where, as Mike Pence suggested during the vice presidential debates, yeah, politicians disagreed, but at the end of the day they'd go on the Lolita Express together, gave us the Iraq War, one of the biggest disasters in American history, then I'm starting to like division quite a bit.
So, you may be wondering what the American midterm elections have to do with the Canadian television series that ran in the mid-2000s. No, I got nothing.
Wait, John, are you saying the world of animated PSAs is kind of wild? Seriously, jokes like that don't work, not just because the punchline is incredibly predictable, although make no mistake, it very much is, but also because, yeah, I clicked on a video called The Wild World of Modern PSAs. I expect things to get a little weird.
Hey guys, want to know what I just did? I just looked up how to register to vote.
And then I took the pledge to not have sex until after I got married. Same energy. Same fucking energy.
How? Are they both monotone? Is that the point? Because that just means the acting in the PSA is bad. I don't get what John's point is here.
Have you seen what he's done today?
Who?
Trump! He's repealing the gun restrictions!
I reiterate, these characters are Canadian. They are Canadian within the short. They expressly state that. And the president can't just unilaterally repeal laws. I know that that's a joke, that we eventually find out that they are Canadian, but it doesn't work as a joke. The setup actually needs to make sense in the universe in which the show takes place.
And yet, you've also stated that it played on Cartoon Network, and that you're American, when those episodes also originally aired, which meant that there's actually a US fan base for the show. Like, did you not notice that? On top of that, the YouTube channel Retro Rerun talks about how it's a PSA for Americans, as this is a PSA about voting in the midterm elections for Americans.
But #hashtag carrot key hashtag MTR. What if a Canadian decides to watch this PSA and attempts to vote in the American midterm election?
Then they're being dumb. Because they're not American. Like, sure, one could maybe argue as to why it's off, though I could argue back by saying that with America being a big powerhouse developed country, there's going to be a big impact on the relationships with other countries out there and that we should talk about it, but this is really just harmless at the end of the day.
And I mean, it's not like you couldn't make this joke make sense. The most passionate person about American politics you will ever meet is probably a Canadian. But until the punchline, it's like they literally believe that they are in another country.
Well, Tom, that's the joke!
And I know that Canada and the US look alike. Many people, even living in the respective countries, might not be able to discern a photograph between the two. But we are different countries, and we have different issues.
This is like watching Gollum make a review. He's constantly pointing out why his point doesn't make sense, only to say that it actually does work for reasons he can't explain. They think they're Americans! Yes, they do. They do. But they know that they aren't. That's the joke. Oh, but they seriously thinks it. No, they don't. That's my Gollum impression. What do you guys think?
And now he's starting a trade war with Canada. I mean, who doesn't like Canada?
I'm guessing you guys don't, since you've apparently renounced all your Canadian citizenship.
Well, Eddie, that's the joke!
Like, this short goes on and on, showing about how all the characters have changed and giving a general update on their life. It's something that would have been nice if it wasn't mired in current political bullshit. I mean, 2 years on, and this midterm is a distant memory, so it comes across as awkward and outdated. The swearing doesn't help much either. Also, they keep using the word millennial over and over again. Number one, I don't think that term even existed when the show came out.
John, the term millennial was coined in 1987.
It definitely wasn't in widespread use. But here's the, fun fact. If you turned 18 in 2018, you're not a millennial! You're a member of Generation Z, or Gen Z, whatever. No, not that Gen Z. We do not speak of that Gen Z ever. This whole thing really does feel like it's concentrated. Hello, fellow kids!
And this is the part where I now have to talk to you guys about why we're doing a synopsis for almost everything that Enter is reviewing. Or at the very least, one of the reasons. Yeah, the thing about it is that there's actually a couple of things. Like this part here, that Enter completely missed the point on some of these PSAs. If Enter would have just written down a synopsis of what was going on, then he wouldn't have left stuff out or not get stuff wrong. For example, if any of you recall my synopsis in this PSA, then you would know why they used the term millennial. It is because, and repeating my co-op partner here, millennials composes the largest voting group and thus can swing an entire election. They weren't wrong about this too. Usually millennial turnout during the midterm elections were pretty low until the 2018 midterm election. Not only that, but Coach Hadler dismissed all millennials as special snowflakes with participation trophies, and Ron telling the teens about how they haven't experienced war. I will concede that they could have reworded this properly to provide actual statistics about it, and admittedly not have this generation war going on, as well as admittedly a somewhat good point that you've brought up about how the poor wording with them being millennials in 2018. But they didn't just throw the word around. They actually had a point to them.
You doofuses know we can't vote in the US election, right? We're Canadian!
Like, here's another thing about this punchline. If you do care about American politics at all, you'll know how disrespectful this is. Since 2016, foreign election interference has become a very real concern in the United States. And it's not something that Americans would find a laughing matter. Doesn't matter if it's Russian, Chinese, Venezuelan, or Canadian, it's not funny. And it's quite tone deaf on some American citizens' actual concern.
Boy, do you just like to get offended by that, do you? No, I'm not even joking about that. This is you taking a huge reach about something that's actually not even about election interference at all. It's just 16s being complete dumbasses that they forgot that they're Canadian. And at the end of it, they actually drop what they're doing and just move on with their lives. How is this election interference?
Fucking Canadians stealing our election. Justin Trudeau is trying to make PSAs telling Americans to vote so he can steal our elections. That's just a fact. Everybody knows that.
This message is approved by Ronald Reagan.
I don't get it. I'm also ending it here. See you all in part 3.